Good morning, everybody. I hope you've got your coffee cups and your kettles have all brewed up. It is amazing to welcome you to this event with myself, Dr. Rosena, Allin-Khan, Keir, Starmer, and some wonderful organisations led by fantastic people who are all putting loneliness at the top of our agenda. It is fantastic to have you here this morning. We are waiting for a few more members to join, so I will just talk for a couple of minutes. During this unprecedented time across the country, there has been a huge surge in loneliness owing to the coronavirus. It is a hidden crisis. People are telling me when I work on our A&E frontline and in my MP inbox that young people are experiencing loneliness like never before, being cut off from education, jobs and family. The world they live in has shrunk and they should not be forgotten by this crisis. There are also the elderly and the shielding who are unable to get out and see those that they have that they love the most in this world. And there are people who are dealing with grief in a way that we've never ever experienced before, where they've been robbed of the opportunity to say goodbye to the ones that they love. So I wanted to make, in my role, I wanted to make tackling loneliness a priority. And I've been so glad that Keir has made this a priority too. We've had many, many discussions over the last few weeks about how together we can reach out to our communities. We can work with people who are experts in this field and somehow work together to make sure that this world feels a little less lonely during these unprecedented times. And while doing that, talk about a strategy to try and rid our communities of loneliness for good, once and for all. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you this morning Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party.
Rosena, thank you so much. And can I also thank all our fantastic panellists who've come on this morning. Really, really looking forward to hearing from you. So thank you for giving up your time. And thank you to everybody who's come on the line. I think there's thousands of people have already joined us, Rosena. So that's really, really fantastic and just an indication, I think, of how important this issue is. Before we even get to COVID-19, loneliness is something I think that we haven't seen enough focus on. We haven't understood as well as we should. And over recent years, there has been, a lot more work done on loneliness, a lot more awareness, and that's been really, really important. And we need to keep pushing that. But COVID-19 has obviously added a completely new dimension to loneliness that, as ever with COVID-19 sort of digs away at issues that were there, underlying issues that were there all of the time. The reasons are obvious: huge anxiety. We can all feel it across our families, our friends and our communities. Huge anxiety about the health issues that COVID-19 throws up. Everybody is worried about somebody. And that's the reality of the situation. Many of us have known people who've had the virus, some of us even of people who've died from the virus. And so that anxiety, particularly when you overlay the groups that are then particularly at risk, which just adds to that anxiety. And it's palpable, you can feel it across the country. I think, Rosena, there's also a growing anxiety now about the economy and what's going to happen next. I think there's a sense that people know that we've been perhaps in a bit of a bubble on the economy with the furlough schemes, the self-employed schemes, and that you only got to look at the indicators the last few days and weeks to realise that what is a health crisis is also an economic crisis, and that adds the anxiety. And then, of course, you've got people self-isolating, not able to see each other. That fuels the loneliness that is there, and the lack of human contact that I think everybody is feeling, just the inability to be with one another in the usual way. I think have made this a really profound issue, which is why I think, Rosena, it's really important we're coming forward this morning to have this discussion. It's really, really timely, because this is a really serious discussion about the extent of the issue, the depth of it, but also with our panelists, a sense of how do we find our way through this? Because this isn't an on-off button. It isn't going to all be over in a few weeks. It's something that we need to manage through. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists on this. And I'm really, really delighted that so many people have come on the call. You never quite know with Zooms, in my experience, whether people are going to come on, whether they're going to think it is important and want to be part of it. And I'm really delighted to see the numbers that we got this morning. I think, Rosena, that just shows just how important this is, how important we all take it. And I'll hand back to you, but with the anticipation of hearing from our panelists and having a really good discussion for the rest of the time we've got together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keir. And we need to keep this spirit up once the pandemic is over. We cannot return to business as usual, and we must build back better. So it brings me great pleasure to start introducing our fantastic panelists who actually devote their whole lives to reducing inequalities when it comes to mental ill health and tackling the issue of loneliness. So I'm going to introduce them and ask them to say a little bit about where they're from. So I'd love to introduce, first of all, Amy Perrin from the Marmalade Trust.
Hi, my name is Amy Perrin. I'm a health professional. I've got 15 years experience of working for the NHS. I regularly saw the impact that loneliness was having on my patients, on their health and well-being. So back in 2013, I decided to start a charity called Marmalade Trust. Our mission is to create a society where we recognise that loneliness exists, and we support each other to find new connections. We're based out of Bristol. We run various project delivery, which is all volunteer-led, which includes community events on Christmas Day, social prescribing, and more recently, a volunteer companion scheme in response to Covid-19. Alongside this, I feel personally really passionately that there is some real shame and stigma attached with loneliness. And so in 2017, we decided to launch the UK's first Loneliness Awareness Week. So this week, it's Loneliness Awareness Week, and we're hosting a campaign which is about understanding loneliness as much as we can.
Thank you, that's absolutely brilliant. And yes, this is the start of Loneliness Awareness Week, and what a fantastic way to kick off. I would love to introduce Jo Cox's sister, Kim Leadbeater, and we know that it was 4 years tomorrow since Jo Cox was so brutally taken from us, and it is an honour to have you here today, Kim.
You're muted, Kim.
Thank you very much, Rosena. Yeah, it's my name's Kim Leadbeater, and as Rosena says, sadly, tough week for me. It's 4 years tomorrow since Jo was killed. But one of the things that has kept me going during the last 4 years has been the work that we've done through the foundation that we set up in her name, tackling some really important issues that the country has faced in those last 4 years. And they've not been an easy 4 years in many ways. And in terms of loneliness, Jo felt passionately about loneliness, and she'd started working on a cross-party basis in her short time as an MP on the issue of loneliness, having done some research in the constituency and found that many people had issues around loneliness and social isolation. And then after Jo was murdered, that work was picked up with Jo's friend Rachel Reeves, who has done an amazing amount of work on this subject with us, on a cross-party basis, again working with Seema Kennedy, and a very good example of how Jo was very keen to work on the issues and sometimes ignore the tribalism of party politics and actually focus on getting the job done. So we've done loads of stuff on loneliness, and I'm really pleased that in a coalition with lots of other organisations, some of whom are represented today, we ended up with the world's first ever Minister for Loneliness and the world's first ever government strategy on loneliness. And the stuff that we do on loneliness feeds very much into our desire to build strong, compassionate, well-connected communities where everybody has a sense of identity and belonging.
Thank you so much, Kim. And you honestly have done such incredible work, and you have rightly, really highlighted the importance of working cross-party. This is not a political issue. This is an issue of humanity and how we can work together to really ensure that people are not feeling lonely. And it also brings me great pleasure to introduce Katherine Anderson, who is also from the Jo Cox Foundation. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, morning. Thank you so much for kicking off Loneliness Awareness Week with this event. And as Kim said, it's a huge privilege to continue Jo's work on loneliness. And I think, if it hadn't been for Jo using her platform to really shine a light on the work that hundreds of organisations like Marmalade Trust, like many others on this call, had been doing, we wouldn't have been able to turbocharge the issue and really be able to have this conversation today. The government strategy from 2018 was a direct result of the Jo Cox Loneliness Commission report, and it had three main aims: to end stigma, to build the evidence base, and to support civil society in tackling loneliness. And on that last point, we've really been trying to do our bit through COVID by establishing another platform, the Connection Coalition, which is a growing group of over 400 organisations, all working on social and emotional well-being, but in and around the issue of loneliness, who are looking at this upswing of community action and kindness and neighbourliness that we've seen through coronavirus, and to ensure that we carry on those actions well beyond this acute moment that we're seeing, because we know that less lonely, more connected neighbourhoods equal more cohesive communities and societies, and that will help us to withstand so much of the divisions that we're seeing today and the issues we will see in the future. So huge thank you for having this event and for raising the importance of loneliness now. And it's a real pleasure to join my colleagues here on this call.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And obviously we know that our elderly in the community are suffering immeasurably at the moment, being isolated from their families. Many, actually have dementia and are even more confused by not being able to see their loved ones. And it brings me great pleasure to introduce from Age UK, Caroline Abrahams.
Thank you very much, and for giving me an entry that meant that I had time to unmute my mic. It was very smart. It's great to be here today, and obviously we're all different people who work with different parts of the community, and that just shows that loneliness is an issue that can affect anyone at any time, and some of us too, probably on this call. So I work for Age UK. I'm the charity director there. And Age UK is both a national charity and lots of small local charities, such as I know the one that Keir knows very well in his own constituency in Camden. So we have 130 of those local Age UKs, and they've been incredibly busy during the pandemic. They're always very busy, but they've changed what they do, particularly to respond to the needs of older people who, as Rosena was absolutely saying, stuck at home really, very often are afraid to go out, or actually told they shouldn't go out, cut off from their normal support networks. So our local Age UKs have been really busy delivering food parcels, but also very importantly doing check-in calls by phone to make sure that people are actually feeling okay. And that builds on work that we do all the time. And with our partners, the Silver Line, which is set up by Esther Anderson, which is there to provide friendship to older people, particularly when they need it most, even if that's 4 o'clock in the morning. It's open all day and all night, particularly for that purpose. And of course, we run an enormous kind of information advice service. And we do get lots of calls on that too from people who are lonely. And I know we're going to talk some more, I'm sure, about the pandemic and its impact, but I'll just say now that we've noticed a very big upsurge in the numbers of older people coming to us wanting friendship calls in particular, just to keep them ticking over in what must feel to some of them like a sort of endless kind of journey, stuck at home, wondering when they're ever going to be able to mix with the rest of us again.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that when Keir and I speak of this issue, we talk a lot about the incredible work that you do in the community for our older people. It brings me great pleasure to introduce Ruth Sutherland from the Samaritans.
Hi, thanks very much. And thanks so much for the opportunity to really galvanise some action on this really important topic. So as you may know, Samaritans, we offer a 24/7 emotional support through a network of 20,000 volunteers operating from over 200 centres across the UK and Ireland. We also work in every prison in the country. We work with the military, we work with the rail industry, we work in local communities and with local government on suicide prevention planning. We also offer media guidance, policy and influencing work, all so that fewer people will die by suicide. And I would say across all our experience, social isolation, exclusion and loneliness are at the heart of much of the distress that people are coping with.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And you have reminded us that there are so many groups that often aren't factored into the conversation about loneliness. So thank you very much for being here today. We know that the mental health of children and young people are suffering greatly at this time, many being unable to see their friends, unable to go to school. They have anxiety about their exams. They have anxiety about how the world looks so different to them at the moment. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce Claire Stafford from Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here and to bring the focus on children and young people in particular. My name's Claire Stafford. I'm the Vice Chair of the Children and Young People's Mental Health Coalition. I'm also the Chief Executive of the Charlie Waller Trust, which, like the Joe Cox Foundation, was a charity founded from a terrible tragedy. The coalition brings the sector voice together for children and young people in relation to mental health. There are over 200 organisations which are very sort of rooted in their communities. The young person's voice is really central to all of our work, and it includes lots of frontline charities who are experiencing quite an increase in demand at the moment. So this is a really salient issue.
Thank you so much. And next, I would like to introduce somebody for whom their charity I raised money for many years ago by jumping out of a plane. I think my team are currently very worried I may try the same antics going forward, but it brings me really great honour to introduce Paul Farmer from Mind.
Thanks very much, Rosena, and thank you for your support of Mind, greatly appreciated. And we hope to help you jump out of a plane again sometime, hopefully with parachutes on, I hasten to add.
Oh, the bonus.
So I'm Paul Farmer, Chief Executive of the mental health charity Mind. We're obviously here to support people with the experience of mental health problems, and let's not forget that's around about 17 or 18 million of us at any time in any given year. But also those people who are at risk of developing mental health problems, both through our national influencing and service provision work, but also through our local network of 120 local minds scattered across England and Wales. And what we've heard from people, from our local minds and from people who contact us nationally, is that this period has absolutely accentuated their sense of isolation and loneliness. After all, probably the word of the year is self-isolation. And who would have thought that we would have kind of institutionally required so many people to spend so much time on their own? So it's really timely, and thank you for gathering us all together to have this conversation about how we can help tackle that sense of isolation, which many people will have experienced most acutely for the first time just in the last few weeks. So thanks for bringing us together. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, sorry, had a little bit there. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's absolutely fantastic to have you. What we'll do now is just start by asking some questions, and I might bring some of you guys in to answer. So I think first of all, it'd be really good to try and understand what are the actual health implications of loneliness. And I wonder if I may bring Amy in at this point.
I think it's important to remember that we're, as human beings, and we've evolved to need to have social contact. And actually loneliness can be seen as a bit of a signal that we need to address. It's a bit like hunger, which is a warning that we need to eat. It's a really common emotion for a lot of us. For most of us, it's likely to be quite a transient thing that we will experience at some point in our lives. But for many, it can turn into a longer chronic health problem. For those that are experiencing chronic loneliness, there is substantial and growing evidence that it has an effect on mortality that is comparable to well-known risk factors such as obesity, and it has a similar influence as smoking cigarettes. Its higher risks also include a variety of mental health and physical health problems, such as an increase in blood pressure, cardiac disease, a weakened immune system, particularly important at the moment, and cognitive decline. But not only are these effects really devastating for the individual that's experiencing chronic loneliness, it's also going to have a huge impact on health and social care. A significant amount of GP appointments have loneliness as a factor. We know that there are over 2 million over 75s living alone who may experience an increased risk of loneliness and therefore consume more of these health and social care things. And it's important to note as well that of those living alone, of the older people, that they're more likely, 50% more likely to access emergency care services and also have an increased risk of care home admission. So not only is it really chronic loneliness, is really not great for your health, it's actually having quite an impact on other services in our system.
Thank you so much. And Kim, would you say that it's been your experience that people who originally start off by just seeming to feel a bit lonely actually find that this becomes more and more progressive and they suffer with other ill health as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can be very debilitating. I mean, my background is in physical activity and health and well-being. So I used to lecture in taking a very holistic approach to our health. So it's really important that we are not separating the physical aspects of our health from the emotional and the mental aspects of our wealth. And I think loneliness is one of those where, you know, those are intrinsically interlinked. So we can have emotional and psychological issues around feeling lonely, which can induce anxiety and can affect our self-esteem and our confidence, and then that has a knock-on effect to our health and our well-being. We suddenly are not that bothered about looking after ourselves anymore, so we might not exercise anymore, or we might, you know, neglect looking after our hygiene and those sorts of things. So the physical and the mental are very much intrinsically interlinked, and that's why I think when we're looking to tackle loneliness, we have to take a very holistic approach, which is why it's great to have such a variety of people on the call today. So yeah, I think going forward, joining up the physical implications of loneliness along with the mental health implications is really important.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, Katherine, if I can ask you, right, for people watching this call today, what would be some of the first signs that they could be looking out for to think maybe I do need a bit of extra help here? I'm not feeling okay. What are some of the things that would be like red flags for them to go and seek more help?
Well, I think the thing with loneliness is there are so many variables, Rosena, which you will know yourself. And Amy has rightly pointed out the health implications in terms of mental health, cognitive decline, heart disease, diabetes, so on, depression, etc. And Kim has rightly raised the issue of the holistic approach. The thing about loneliness is it's not all that easy to spot in isolation. So I think there are all sorts of different risk factors, from the environment in which a person lives, not necessarily being alone, because being alone does not equal being lonely. You can be surrounded by people and be experiencing extreme cases of loneliness. So one of the things I would say we could talk about, which would be really interesting and a way forward, is how important is social prescribing. That is the way in which we link GP surgeries up to community activity, so that when they encounter a patient who they think is experiencing or is at risk of loneliness, that they can be directed to community activity, which goes back to our point about why connected communities are so important to tackling loneliness. There's an awful lot of material available about how you can spot people at risk of loneliness. But I think that one of the things that we really need is to consider that, you know, the obvious age groups are not always those who are experiencing loneliness. I know we'll come on to that, but to be looking for you know, signs of loneliness in age groups that we think would not be suffering. So, for example, younger people, 18 to 24, are equally at risk and experiencing loneliness as the elderly age group. So I think I would say let's look at things in the round and consider the variables that contribute, rather than looking at loneliness and the symptoms of loneliness just in isolation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Caroline, I know that you obviously work a lot with our older communities, and you also work with carers and the people who support the vulnerable. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about the loneliness experienced by carers and families who are unable to go and see their elderly relatives, people that they love the most.
Yeah, absolutely. So for carers, I mean, there are 7-8 million carers in our society. Absolutely. Loads of us are caring for people, including me, including probably. Oh, yeah, great. And for people who are caring full time, with, say, for example, for somebody with dementia, a parent or a partner, that's an all-consuming job, really, and it's very difficult to get away. And what happens, I think, particularly to people in that situation, is that over time they find that their social networks start to disappear because they just can't keep them up anymore. In some ways, for the people like that, it's easier at the moment because if they're on technology, at least they can keep in touch. But during normal times, the capacity to go out and meet people for a meal or something is going to be sharply reduced. So the carers can, even though they're living with somebody else, can be very, very lonely. And it's important to remember that loneliness is about you feeling personally that you haven't got enough relationships, enough companionship in your life. And so what I might consider to be lonely might be different to you, and it's a very, very personal thing. And at the moment, of course, as Rosena says, people have been cut off and unable to meet up with friends and particularly with family. That's just starting to change now. But of course, we're still in this slightly odd situation where if you've got 3 or 4 children, for example, if you're an older person and a number of grandchildren, you're having to choose who you might bubble with, which is difficult, I think, in families and still a sadness to many. And if you're shielding, you're still shut in. That's the end of it, really. So still a long way to go before we can help those people get their companionship back.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. And I know that so many people actually tend to think of the shielding community as being the over 70s, but there are so many young people as well that are normally able to work, that might have, you know, a autoimmune disease that they manage that nobody knows about. And there they are now, stuck at home, unable to provide for their families, unable to leave the house, and they have children that they can't even take out because they're meant to be shielding, and that can be very, very lonely for some. I'm wondering, Ruth, have you seen the number of calls to your helplines go up? What sorts of trends are you seeing in the sorts of people that you're hearing from in Samaritans?
Yeah, I mean, the Samaritans is always busy, you know, always full up with people particularly experiencing that kind of loneliness and isolation. I mean, we're social animals. We are meant to connect, and it is the loss of human connection which is so bad for us. And the point that was made about loneliness in a crowd, we certainly hear about that. It's the quality of the relationship, the reciprocal nature of the relationship, which is the nourishing thing, both but also restorative in its kind of nature. But so, I mean, about 1/3 of our calls at the moment are COVID related. And in that group, loneliness and isolation is being talked about. Yeah. It's as time goes on, it's being felt more acutely, more deeply. And it's the long nature and the uncertainty of it. We take about 7,000 calls a day. So you can appreciate this is a lot of people who are really suffering with this disconnection. I mean, suicidal thinking is actually quite common, and suicide is, you know, many things. It is not just loneliness. It's a combination of many things, but there is an association between loneliness and suicide. And the concern is that the greater levels of isolation that people are feeling, the greater the levels of the suicidal ideation and thinking may start to come. I think important to particularly highlight groups. We've heard about young people. Our own research talked about the young people themselves, talked about the stigma of admitting that you have no friends was worse than talking about your own mental health for them. But another forgotten group, we produced a report recently, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, low-income, middle-aged men who are the most disconnected and will feel the impact of this situation to a greater degree. And this is a group that is furthest away from support and the most disconnected. So we really need to see how we're going to respond to those groups.
Thank you very much. I think that's really important for us to note when we look at work that we do, you know, going forward after this. We don't want any group or community to be left behind. And I know that right now there is so much talk about the economy and the importance of rebuilding it and getting people back into work. But just recently, I had a call with some young people who have said, what about us? We are young teenagers, we're in school, we don't know what this means for our education and our future. And I just wonder if, Claire, you could talk a little bit about some of the physical impacts and the things that we can be looking out for to support our younger members of the community.
Thanks, Rosena. Yeah, we do know that the impact of loneliness affects physical health, it affects mental health with young people. And I think something that's really crucial is actually it can have an impact on academic attainment as well. So that's their whole future and their whole life is affected. I think we need to think about more vulnerable young people. So we know there's been a rise in domestic violence during the period of lockdown. And actually it can be really lonely for a young person living in a house where that kind of thing's going on. They might not be alone, but actually it's a really isolating experience. And then I think with the important focus on mental health, definitely isolation exacerbates mental health problems. If you're already feeling low, you're feeling worthless and maybe not deserving of support. If you're then lonely and isolated as well, it makes it so much worse. And as Ruth was saying, I think, young people won't seek help because it is a stigma. So they don't feel able to come forward. But it is a really, really big issue for our children and young people at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you make such an important point, because also being lonely is not about how many people are there in the room. We know that for so many people that have worked on our front line, driving our buses, serving in our supermarkets, working in our NHS, working in the care sector, they have come home and felt lonely because they're dealing with the burden of worrying about spreading the virus to their loved ones. And that can be a very, very lonely place for them psychologically. And Paul, if I may bring you in on the work that you're doing in Mind, what are you finding regarding physical health issues and people who are suffering with mental ill health?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that, the last few weeks have really highlighted the kind of acute pressure that particular groups have come under. And I think you make a really interesting point about the isolation of that, of working in a frontline environment. And along with Samaritans and other organisations, we set up the Our Frontline campaign, which has now had over really nearly 100,000 people contacting us in a matter of a few weeks, asking for help for their mental health, and I think that's that kind of idea of your working or your relationship status or the situation you find yourself in, creating a sense of isolation and loneliness is a really important one for us to hold, because in and of itself, loneliness is not a mental health problem. People quite often think that is the case, but it absolutely is a risk factor in leading to developing mental health problems. And I think that's particularly the case when you are experiencing other issues. So if you're experiencing poor physical health, that increases your sense of isolation. If you're experiencing, as others have noted, I think we're particularly also worried about the experiences of men who are out of work or at risk of losing their job or in precarious workplaces, where our survey is also telling us that students are quite anxious about the current situation. They've been thrown out of their usual kind of situation into a very different kind of situation. So when you add the kind of ingredient of loneliness and isolation into other pre-existing risk factors, then that's when you start to see the mental health problem becoming much more likely or much more of a risk. And so it's really important that we think about how we bring together those kind of multiple risk factors to intervene with this particular group of people. And we think this group is, at the very, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people who are increased risk of developing a mental health problem as a result of their increased sense of isolation.
Thank you so much. I know that, when Keir and I have spoken over the last few weeks just about the importance of this issue, he's really clear that we have a strategy on tackling this. And I would love to bring Keir in now, to make some comments on some of the things that have been said thus far.
Yeah, well, Rosena, thanks very much. I mean, just hearing the comments, there's so many strands and overlapping strands, whether it's age, whether it's gender, whether it's issues, and I'm particularly struck by the hard to reach, in a sense, those people that not only lonely but getting the support in is very, very difficult. And Rosena, I was going to go to a slightly different question, which is really given that we're in the middle of this crisis, tackling loneliness is even more difficult than it otherwise is, because how do you tackle it whilst we've got social distancing rules, which we're going to have for some time? And I'd just really like to pick the brains of the panelists on that question. What practically can we do? I think this is something a lot of people on the line will be thinking about, which is how then do we tackle this in this really, really difficult time? What can we do? And I think people will be searching that as individuals, as members of teams and groups, and it'd be fascinating to hear from everyone on this, because what we've had so far, Rosena, is on every question there's a slightly different strand or perspective, which is fantastic. Therefore, I just wonder whether we could have a quick round tackling that issue, maybe starting again with Amy. Practical, how do we tackle this now, just at the whilst we're in social distancing, which whatever form it takes is probably with us for some considerable time?
I think firstly it's important to say that a lot of people who are experiencing loneliness at any time often talk about feeling invisible and not heard. And so one of the most important things that we can do now more than ever is just show that we understand loneliness. And this is a perfect week to be able to do that. It's Loneliness Awareness Week. Let's really, really show people that we do understand, as Paul said, this common emotion that can lead to mental health difficulties, but isn't a mental health problem. If you're feeling lonely, I would say from personal experience, I've been lonely, I will be lonely again. I think it's an unpleasant feeling, but it is so common. Reach out to people, identify what you need, look into your network and see where you need to find some help. And very much about looking at your community, your network. Let's use this as a bit of an excuse this week and going forward to connect. Let's talk to our neighbours, let's reach out to our community, ask people in our network, consider people that you haven't thought about, and consider the variety of experiences as well. We're certainly talking to people who are actually experiencing less loneliness at the moment. So that just shows you that we need to have an understanding about this emotion. We've spoken with wheelchair users who've said the built environment is a very difficult place for them. So actually now at the moment they're accessing art clubs and groups and they feel really part of society. And the same with single mums, or single parents, been really common. They've said that actually at this moment in time they feel like everybody else. And so they're able to access the virtual things and pub quizzes and things. So it's a complex emotion, but it's really, really important that we actually start to build our understanding right now.
Thank you, Amy. And I mean, that reaching out both ways is really, really important. And one of the things Rosena will do is to make the contact details and support available, because there's going to be a lot of people on the line, I think, Amy, who will resonate with that sense of people being lonely from time to time, drifting in and out of it. And I think it's inevitable with people listening in who might need or want to know where the support is, so we can make that available. Kim, can I come to you on this question as well, in terms of support in a period of social distancing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the quotes that we attribute to Joe is that loneliness doesn't discriminate and it can affect any of us at any stage in our lives. And I think it's been great to consider that this morning in terms of different ages and gender and also, what's going on in your life, whether you're a student, life-changing events often make us very vulnerable to feeling lonely. And let's be fair, the situation we're all in at this moment in time, is a real leveller. We're all impacted by this pandemic in one way or another. So it's been a real leveller for us all to potentially feel lonely, even people who've never felt lonely before. So it's really important that we're having these conversations, and that's why today is brilliant. I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet, which is social media, and I think social media in these times is a double-edged sword. It's a brilliant way of staying connected, and we've seen some wonderful initiatives. I think one of the things that I have observed, though, is there is also a little bit of a danger of comparing ourselves, and social media is one of the ways that we've seen that. So, it's wonderful if someone is managing to do 6 hours of homeschooling and learn Spanish Spanish and the ukulele at the same time. But actually, if we're seeing those things, suddenly that makes us feel very inadequate, that we're having a really bad day and feeling quite lonely. So I think we need to just be careful about the use of social media in the crisis. We don't want to make people feel that they're not good enough. Certainly at a local level, we've seen a real move from practical issues like food shopping and prescriptions to now, as someone said earlier, befriending and phone calls. So I think, you know, let's not lose that the ability to pick up the phone and have a conversation with somebody that we've got very good at. And as we come out of this, we need to keep those habits going, looking out for our neighbours, doing those small acts of kindness and compassion. And the big thing from our perspective, if you're an organisation, you can join the Connection Coalition. We can all work together. You know, at Joe's Foundation, we really believe in true collaboration. Let's pull together our resources. You know, we're better working on this together. And then, on a personal level, we've got Loneliness Awareness Week, which Amy has done a wonderful job of bringing forward in the past few years. And we end Loneliness Awareness Week with the Great Get Together. Ta-da! Which is the annual campaign that we do every year on what would have been Joe's birthday. And I think sometimes people just need a platform to connect. And the Great Get Together is that platform. So at the weekend, clearly adhering to the social distancing guidelines, do something to connect with people in your community. Drop some buns off at your neighbour's house. Write somebody a postcard. You know, we can all do something, and that might trigger something that keeps going in the future. So there's stuff we can all do, and that's the real positive about this issue.
Yeah, you know, Kim, that's great. The Great Get Together is so important, and has been a fantastic way of different bits of communities linking up over the last 3 or 4 years. But the Great Get Together in an age of social distancing is just something you couldn't make up. But it just shows how important it is that we make that extra effort this year.
We have to be very creative, but people are very creative, aren't they? I mean, it's amazing what people have done to stay connected virtually, or just those acts of kindness in communities. Yeah,
and Kim, you touched on those, you know, picking up the phone, those individual acts, because the other thing I think, I don't know what people feel about this is, but on virtual meetings, Zooms, etc., which are great in many respects because you can pull people together that would take forever otherwise, and across, you know, wider geography than perhaps you could otherwise. But you can't have a margin, you can't sort of say something in the margins of a meeting or a chat whilst you're getting the coffee. And it's those little bits of connection that, you know, you're either on screen or you're off screen. You normally in 1 hour slots. Whereas, you know, in a meeting, you'd shuffle in a bit early, or you'd, you know, talk to someone as you're settling in, etc. And all of that is missing. Those little bits of human contact, which I think are, you know, as the years roll by, are more and more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really good that we've learned to operate in this way. And I think we'll see much more of this going forward. But let's be very clear that this is not a substitute for being in the same room as someone and having eye contact, and maybe heaven forbid, touching someone's arm and letting them know that you've got their back type thing. Yeah, so we need both, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Katherine, can I bring you in on this question as well, you know, which is tackling loneliness in this period we're in now, and how we go about it?
Yes, I mean, as Kim says, it's all about really pivoting very quickly from being organisations that deliver face-to-face in community spaces, place-based initiatives where you're bringing vulnerable people together, to thinking about how on earth we do that in now a landscape where terms like social distancing and self-isolation, which none of us had used 3 months ago, are now the norm. They're in our common vocabulary. We could be, looking at heading to epidemic proportions when it comes to loneliness. And as Amy said, groups who formerly were feeling less connected are now feeling more connected. But the downside of that is groups who were formerly very connected are now losing all of those outlets. So, obviously things like befriending networks, intergenerational initiatives for people who are shielding, buddying networks for younger adults and teenagers are all great, but everyone's talking about digitizing these tools, and that's all very well if you have access to tech. So I think provision of tech has got to be part of this campaign as we enter this new period, this new normal. And then, as Kim says, the Great Get Together is one of numerous platforms. Of course, we're biased and we think it's one of the best, but we're seeing our organisers up and down the country doing things in this period which will have learning potential for other community groups up and down the country as we tackle COVID through peaks and troughs. I mean, we've got people who are in Birmingham. We've got someone who's reaching out with food parcels to around 1,000 vulnerable people in their community, giving them crafting kits so that they can be engaged in a sort of communal activity even while they're apart. We're seeing people in Norfolk. We have a volunteer called Pam in Norfolk who is organising a crew of about 100 people to send letters and notes to people who are identified as being at risk, but at all times connecting with their local surgeries, with their local community groups, and that connective tissue between organisations in communities, whether it's the surgery, the community group, the parish council, churches, synagogues. You know, we're seeing interfaith initiatives all over the country. That's how we can strengthen those relationships. And I'm not wearing my Great Get Together t-shirt today because it's freezing in Scotland, but please get involved. And obviously, Keir, we would love you to take part, and Rosena as well. Show your support for the Great Get Together this year.
Yeah, we will do, Katherine, definitely. We'll think about what we do for that. It's very, very good. Carolyn, can I bring you in on this as well? I was really struck when working with Age UK in Camden on food deliveries from one of our day centres, and my instinct was that the food would probably be being distributed to those that usually were using the day centres, and therefore was sort of an outreach operation. But I was really struck by the fact that a lot of the connection, a lot of the food, a lot of the deliveries were going to people who hadn't, older people who hadn't actually felt they needed support before, and suddenly were put in a completely different position by COVID-19, a whole sort of group of people who needed support, and therefore presumably that, you know, tackling loneliness with older people in a period of a crisis like this, or social distancing, particularly difficult, and reaching new people the whole time. I think certainly that's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we worry about this group. We don't know how many there are, probably hundreds of thousands of them, who are not on anyone's list, really. They're not on anyone's radar. In the normal course of events, they probably managed quite well. But the circumstances of the pandemic have made a complete change to that, particularly as regards being able to go out and about. That sometimes people actually, you know, been very confused by the guidance, to be honest, which has changed quite a lot over time. And somebody right at the start of the call mentioned people with dementia. There are, again, hundreds of thousands of people living with dementia in our society. And the last thing they need really is uncertainty, instability, and changing rules. So I think that's been part of the problem here. I think for older people more generally, I suppose what we pick up is something that is somewhere between loneliness on the one hand and the domain of Paul and our friends of Mind and Samaritans on the other, which is a sense really about being forgotten, overlooked, particularly as things start to open up again. And people, we can see, you know, people enjoying themselves on the beach and things like that. There are still lots and lots of older people, not only older people, but particularly I think older people who feel that they're not being able to do those things. They're too vulnerable, or they live with someone who's too vulnerable for them to be able to go out and about. And a real sadness about that, particularly if it's coupled with the experience of loss. And of course, because of the numbers who have died during this pandemic, the enormous numbers, you know, lots of families, lots of older people have been affected by that. So I think that's a sort of sadness, isolation, exclusion, really. Back to that old phrase we haven't used for a while, really, social exclusion. I think that's what we're feeling. I think as much as pure loneliness, it's all those sentiments coming together.
Great, thank you, Rosena. I've got Ruth, Claire and Paul to bring in, if I may, quickly. I realise we're running out of time. I think that's just, there's too much to talk about here, but I do think if we could go to...
going so well.
Ruth, can we come to you and then Claire and to Paul? And I think we should just about be all right for time.
Yeah, we're going quick.
So much to discuss.
Going quick and agreeing with everything that everyone has said. Connection is vital. How do we keep that going? Volunteering, social action, it's good for our mental health, good for us, good for other people. How are we going to incentivize it? How are we going to keep it going as we come forward? We're going to have to be maybe physically distant for some time, but we're going to have to pay more attention to how connected we are. You also talked about the economy. A social recession will be longer and deeper than an economic recession. Unfortunately, suicide rates go up in a recession. But with social protection measures, and absolutely this connectedness, this social action is a social protection measure alongside all the other ones that need to happen. It doesn't have to be like that. So a public health approach, tackling loneliness, putting in social protection measures, making sure those most vulnerable, most disconnected, as we know, the pandemic has shone a stark light on inequality, and it must galvanise our efforts around tackling inequality going forward.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much. And Claire, children and young people, and we've done in Camden, we've had a couple of remote sessions with young people, just discussing their experience of the crisis, and mental health and loneliness has come through there, and the particular problem of reaching children and young people sometimes, particularly when the school was perhaps the environment where it was easiest to sort of capture and notice what was going on. Very, very strong sense of concern about children and young people just at the moment.
Absolutely. What we say in the coalition is really focus on the most vulnerable children, young people. Black and minority ethnic communities have been really impacted by death from COVID-19, and that has a massive impact on young people. Children in care and refugee and migrant children. So if you get it right for them, you'll get it right for everybody. The thing we'd like to sort of pay attention to is also those transitions, because we've had this unprecedented period of time, a long time in a child or a young person's life where they haven't been in school or college. And actually it can be the perfect storm in terms of mental health, loneliness. So we really need to pay attention to those transitions and offer meaningful digital support. I think we've all been catapulted into this digital world in a way we wouldn't have expected. And actually some really good positives about it, but we need to do it carefully. A big feature in terms of going back to school that we'd really encourage is a focus on play. Obviously it is difficult when you've got to have social distancing measures, but actually, you know, the solutions lie with children, with teachers, with support staff. They will work it out if they're given that ability to do that. And then I think really crucially, families and carers need to be equipped to support young people to thrive. They're often in the front line of struggle when their children have mental health problems, and the impact of loneliness and isolation. So we really need to support families and carers during this time. So I think really just some of those practical things and targeting some of the vulnerabilities that we know are there will take us a long way.
Thank you, Claire. And then Paul, if I could bring, and it's really good to see you on screen, Paul. Rosena, Paul helped us a lot in mental health and the criminal justice system when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, and we were trying to introduce policies and guidance that would better accommodate and take proper recognisance of mental health issues. So Paul, it's great to be on screen with you in the same room. But Paul, I mean, again, this is a massive, and Rosena will have this. We do a lot of casework through our surgeries in our constituencies. Some of it comes through by email and phone, but it's the physical surgery where the mental health issues, in my experience, are usually picked up. And of course, that's the bit that's been missing in all of this. So I feel there's certainly more support that is needed just at the moment.
And thank you. And that campaign is still a very important part of our work around ensuring people with mental health problems get access to justice. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the experiences of people with mental health problems at the moment, and I think that is still yet to be fully visible during this period. So I think we particularly encourage you and others, colleagues, to think about how we reach out to people, particularly people perhaps who have been digitally excluded. Lots of our local minds are currently running postcard campaigns, sending cards to a lot of people they haven't seen for a while, saying, please do get back in touch, make contact, you tell us how you are, how you're feeling. We know that from our very large survey that we've done of people with mental health problems, that well over 2/3 of people are saying that their mental health has got worse during this time. So that connection is hugely important. Secondly, I think Ruth's absolutely right. That public health approach to this issue is absolutely, this is what public health is all about in a sense, and it should be absolutely embedded in tackling loneliness and isolation as a really key priority. And thirdly, I think that, you know, this call also really illustrates how this is where the voluntary and community sector comes into its own. It's small local community organisations, it's local minds, local age concerns, branches of Samaritans who are connecting with people inside their communities. And I think support for that, for our sector, that sector to deliver that help over the course of the next few years is going to be really vital if we're going to ensure that people who are often very marginalised, in our case, particularly with people who have existing mental health problems, are going to get the support that they will so desperately need. So, you know, thank you for bringing us together to think about how we work more effectively together, and particularly working with community groups from Black and minority ethnic communities and others to really address this important issue.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all. Rosena, can I pass back to you? I think we're almost out of time, but not quite.
Lovely, wonderful. Before myself and Keir make our closing remarks, can we all just hold our mugs up for a screenshot? Just to say it's been wonderful. Thank you, everybody. That's brilliant. Look, it has been such an illuminating hour, and there were more questions that we could have got through, but you guys have been incredible at covering so many topics during this short period of time. For everyone watching, I just want you to know that it's okay not to feel okay. There are organisations, many of whom you have met here today, who are there to help you. We're going to make sure that we post the information about how to access the help and support, but loneliness doesn't discriminate. We're here for you. This is not a political issue. This is an issue of community and an issue of humanity. And I know what it's like to feel lonely in a crowded room. It doesn't matter who you have in your life. We all can experience loneliness. So please reach out, ask for help. It's okay not to be okay, but know that Keir and I and the Labour Party have your back. And together with the fantastic people that have been on this call today, the fantastic panelists, we're going to do everything that we can to work on issues like tackling stigma, prioritising young people, older people, groups that people didn't even realise there were issues. And we're here for you. So thank you for coming today. And I'm going to hand over to Keir for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Rosena, and thank you for setting this up. Thank you to our panelists for coming on. We could have gone on all morning. So many interesting strands, such an important and necessary and thought-provoking discussion. So thanks to all of you. I'll just end by saying, I think, you know, if there's one thing this crisis has brought into sharp focus, is it's what we really value. And what really matters, and you can see that in so many different ways. The clap on a Thursday, I know it's finished now, but a sense of solidarity across the country, which I hadn't really experienced, where the whole nation is coming together to do something. You know, what do we value? And the discussion we've had today about what we value in terms of mental health, loneliness across different age groups, different communities is really, really important. And I suppose to try and end with a real positive, you know, the more we think about what we value, the better our prospect as we come out of this, that we can hold up and make sure that those values are what drive us going forward. We can always improve, we can always get better, we can always, you know, make sure that tomorrow's world is better than the world we're in at the moment. And I think this focus on values and what matters in this period is a guide through that. So thank you to all of you. Thank you, Rosena. Thank you to everybody who's been on the call. There have been lots and lots of people on the call this morning. A really important discussion. It's been a fantastic privilege to be part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.